7, the departure. Okay? We will repeat it again during the day, but please take care of this notice. So, enjoy. I won't have, yes, I won't have the pleasure to listen to you, by the way. I will read it afterwards. Have a nice day. Enjoy.
Good morning to everybody. We are starting the third session of this Congress. I am Michele Spezzano, Captain Italian Navy. I will play as chairman today. I resume the rule of this session. This is each speaker has 20 minutes for his paper presentation. After 15 minutes, I will remind them that 5 minutes remaining, and at the end of the presentation, there is a round of questions, about 30 minutes. So, please silence your mobile phones, and we start with the first presentation by Jörg Eckekamp from Germany, professor of modern and recent history at the Martin Luther University in Halle and Wittenberg, scientific director at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences in Potsdam, head of the Military History of German Democratic Republic project area, editor of Military History magazine, as you can say, a curriculum full of collaboration with many universities in Europe and outside Europe. Current projects at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences are European Military History, 19th, 21st centuries, and German Military History, 1970-1999. The paper title is The Wars of Liberation and the Rise of German Nationalism in the Early 19th Century. Jörg, the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the organizers to have me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you today. When I learned of the topic of this conference, I was wondering whether or not there has been a war of independence in German history at all. The War of Independence is a historical term which most Germans associate, I would say, with the American War of Independence at the end of the 18th century. But German history also tells us of a War of Independence, although it is not as well known as the American or the Greek revolutions. And this war was and still is referred to as the War of Liberation, sometimes the War of Liberty, where Napoleon's troops were battled between 1813 and 1815. But unlike the Greek case, there is no German national holiday commemorating this war. People have to work. Nobody celebrated the 200th anniversary in October 2013 when the French Grande Armée had been defeated near Leipzig in what was called the Battle of the Nation. Now I will try for the first time the remote control that we have now. Will it work? Okay. Nope. So we'll do it. Okay. The next slide then. So nobody celebrated the 200th anniversary of this battle, which was called the Battle of Nations. And this is not only due, this void is not only due to Germany's experience with nationalism and with war, and hence a reluctance to show national pathos. It is, in my opinion, particularly related to the fact that this German War of Independence was not really a war of the Germans against the French, as this picture might illustrate. The argument I'm putting forward today is that the anti-Napoleonic War was glorified as a major national event only in hindsight. with the rise of German nationalism in the course of the 19th century. My thesis is that it was not the nation that had fought the French and Napoleon. Rather did the fight against Napoleon deliver the material to historically legitimize a German nation and later on, a German nation state. National memorials of the 19th century provide monumental examples of this. Since 1842, for instance, the Walhalla Pantheon near Regensburg has been paying tribute to prominent speakers of the German language. Bavarian King Louis I ordered the construction of the building to commemorate the victory over the French. The Hermannsdenkmal was inaugurated in 1875. The colossal statue, located in the Teutoburg forest, commemorates the battles against the Romans in the year 9, as well as the Franco-German heredity enmity. And today it shows how the middle-class elite retraced German traditions back to the Germanic top people. And lastly, the monument commemorating the Battle of Nations, the Völkerschlacht near Leipzig, was erected in 1913. 100 years after the battle. So these three monumental structures have to be seen as part of one national, if not nationalist, narrative of the 19th century, which was crucial for our idea of this German War of Independence in 1813. Or to be more precise, the interpretation of military conflict as a national war was pivotal. People's armed resistance was the most obvious reaction to Napoleon's occupation of Europe, so it seems. Yet this misleading idea is at hindsight a projection made from a national political perspective, which oversimplifies any kind of rule as foreign domination and does not live up to the variety of possible behaviors in everyday life. And this is why I would like to take the next 10 minutes to elaborate on the specific relation between nationalism and militarism in the violent phase of upheaval in the early 19th century. I would like to emphasize 3 points, or 3 developments. First, the shift of the civil-military relation. Second, what I call the nationalization of war. Next slide. And third, the role of enemy images in this construction. So my first point, the shift of the civil-military relation. In the 18th century, next slide please. Yeah, in the 18th century, most people did not come into direct contact with the military. Only few men became soldiers, the more so as military service was not highly reputable, apart from a career as an officer which was reserved for the aristocracy. The heterogeneous armies were built up based on the recruiting of volunteers, regardless of nationality and confessions. Most people learned about the war only through proclamations or rumors, unless they lived in direct proximity of the battles. All of this changed dramatically in the 19th century, especially due to the introduction of the compulsory service. The military had already been criticized openly by a new educated middle class in the second half of the 18th century. The early liberal idea of a social order was entirely incompatible with the strict hierarchical structure of the military system, the unfair recruiting system, the privileging of the aristocracy, and the military's proper jurisdiction. Moreover, the military served a highly symbolical function. It was considered the epitome of an established order, the linchpin of political reign. And liberals such as Karl von Rotteck, who deemed a political reform indispensable, could not avoid the issue of a military reform. And lastly, there is a relation between national military defense and political participation of the military. According to a widespread belief at the time, those who took up arms and risked their lives to protect the country had a right to participate in shaping the politics of this country. In this sense, the military and the social-political constellation were closely linked. The rulers of the German Empire, however, held on to the concept of a standing army. They feared that arming the people would lead to a revolution, as they had seen in France. And only after they had faced military defeats, the rulers initiated change. Standing mercenary armies were not sufficiently effective and could not be expanded as one wished, for financial reasons at the very last. A spectacular incident. Okay, that's just the wrong direction. Okay, this one. A spectacular incidence of disobedience paved the way for transformation. In 1812, after the French army had failed at the Russian campaign, Prussian General York signed a ceasefire agreement with Russia and broke off Prussia's alliance with France against the Prussian king's will. And only then did the Prussian monarch accept, nolens volens, to open the doors to mass mobilization. He wrote his constitutional promises and the appeal, an mein Volk, to my people, in order to motivate his subjects to join battle. This brings me to my second point, the nationalization of war. Apart from politics and military history, there was a cultural factor which narrowed the gap between the military and civil society, namely the rise of German nationalism. Keep in mind that at that time, there was no German state. A German state didn't exist and hadn't existed before. The idea of a united German people and a German homeland was at first attributed to cultural factors. And the immensely powerful impact of nationalism will change warfare to an extent that military service was upgraded from being merely paid employment to a national service of honor. War itself became more total by using a maximum of resources and mobilizing as many people as possible, men and women in the end, and it aimed at destroying the enemy rather than simply overwhelming him. In this context, the anti-Napoleonic Wars played a crucial role. By nationalizing the war, they were reinterpreted as a German war of independence. The political construction of a nation was inextricably linked to the concept of war, as these wars were elevated through propaganda and called wars of liberty or wars of liberation to the very benefit of the German nation. The relation of war, military, and nationalism can be described by using 5 groups of symbols and patterns which are intertwined and were correlated in practice. Firstly, war was idealized with the ideology of a people's war and depicted as a national war of liberty. The appeal of the Prussian king that I mentioned, which mainly addressed his Prussian subject in the first place, commemorated the latest examples of people's revolts, particularly the Spanish guerrilla war in 1808. Even more so did military appeals, which explicitly also called on young people outside of Prussia. War now did no longer aim at asserting the political interest of a ruler or a particular social group, but rather did it aim at creating such a group, the people, in a revolutionary war. Secondly, the idealization of war went hand in hand with enhancing the appreciation of the military. This is where the citizen soldier came into play, a new type of soldier in the revolutionary armies. It was now possible for soldiers of any rank to obtain a special honor where military and national symbols overlapped. Being at war meant that every single warrior was also nationalized. Instead of a mercenary, there was a German soldier, or, as you can tell by the title, the, quote, Deutsche Kriegs- und Wehrmann. This was the title of a handbook published in 1814 by Ernst Moritz Arndt. Even a common soldier could now potentially be decorated with an award, the Iron Cross, which had been specifically established. Dying and killing on the battlefield, which were at the core of the war experience of every soldier, could easily be woven into this national ideology. You are familiar with the idea. Those who had died, quote, at the homeland's altar, auf dem Altar des Vaterlandes, were commemorated by name. As the young poet and freedom fighter Theodor Körner put it, once, quote, once our hour has come in battle's red, welcome now blissful soldiers' death. Or allow me to quote in German, und schlägt unser Stündlein im Schlachtenrot, willkommen dann, selger Soldatentod. Thirdly, war and the military were reinterpreted based on the creation of the German nation. Part of the national self-image were ideas like the German linguistic community and a historical community of faith that reached back, as I said in the beginning, to the Germanic tribes, so more or less 2,000 years. Arminius, later known as Hermann, chieftain of the Cherusci tribe, became the prototype of a warrior against the Romans who were regarded as progenitors to the French. The drama Hermann's Battle is an example of how young German poets adopted and promoted this narrative. According to the nationalist interpretation of war, contemporaries supposedly belonged to a social entity that was in life-threatening danger. It was a matter of life or death for the political collective, not only for single individual people. And it did not only affect the Kingdom of Prussia or the Kingdom of Westphalia or the Duchy of Berg, Grand Duchy of Berg. No, the entire German nation was in acute danger, according to this ideology. The existence of all German citizens and subjects seemed to be at stake. So the War of Independence was turned into an act of collective self-defense, where the German people had to prove their existence, which after all had been the premise of the very argument. And this is just one of the many paradoxes of nationalism. Fourth, the Germans were presented as the people of God. This religious argument justified the national war. It was claiming that it was a fight for re-establishing a divine order. And in reference to Arndt's handbook for soldiers, the Catechism for the Deutsche Kriegs- und Wehrmacht, was subtitled, quote, where one is taught how to be a Christian soldier and how to go to war with God. Zitat in German, worin gelehrt wird, wie ein christlicher Wehrmann sein und mit Gott in den Streit gehen soll. In this handbook, Napoleon is not only described as the commander of a foreign army, but rather as the incarnation of Antichrist himself. And this takes me to my third point, before I will reach the conclusion. The role of enemy images in anti-French propaganda. And there is no doubt who the enemy was. It was Napoleon and the French. The negative image which was painted of Napoleon consisted of two motives. On the one hand, the French emperor was seen as the epitome of an illegitimate ruler. Napoleon was depicted as a tyrant who had ruthlessly subdued foreign countries and had set himself up as their emperor in an act of godless hubris. His foreign rule had been erected on the basis of violent acts of war, which was condemned as a breach of peace. And on the other hand, Napoleon was presented as an unmitigated misanthrope, even as the devil himself. He supposedly was a traitor to all that is human and most sacred. He had ignored existing borders, customs, and linguistic differences, and despised religion. Now, these stereotypes were not completely new. They were older stereotypes that had been updated in the war, painting the picture of the French in stark contrast to the Germans. In journals, a specific national character was used to constantly play on the dichotomy between good and evil. The most common contrastive pairs were German honesty versus French trickery, lies and deception, truth and authenticity versus foreign band, even temper and strict moral versus lust and fornication. And these stereotypical labels were not invented, of course, during these wars, but they were tailored to the situation, and they reflected the values of the German middle class. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude my paper. The title of my lecture is The Wars of Liberation, a Myth. The campaigns against the French armies are beyond question. Yet there is doubt regarding their interpretation as wars of liberation, which supposedly restored the independence of the German nation. In the early 1800s, that interpretation was very close to propaganda in calling to resistance against Napoleon and referring to specifically national symbols. Nationalism served as an ideology of legitimization, of integration, and of mass mobilization. I spoke about three developments: the fundamental shift of civil-military relations, the nationalization of war, and the impact of enemy images. This causal relation can also be reversed. In hindsight, the War of Independence is a reminder that the emergence of the national concept was shaped by belligerent violence. The relation between war and nationalism grew increasingly radical up until the First World War. And this process of radicalization was further fueled by glorifying the anti-Napoleonic wars as national wars of independence. Let me remind you of the memorials at the beginning of my talk. My dear colleagues, I would like to thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg, for your interesting and original presentation, and also to be stay in the timing. So you can pass to the second presentation by Dr. Bülent Durgun from Turkey, graduated in mechanical engineering and PhD in history. In his more than 28 years in the Turkish armed force, has been committed in national and international environment as commanding and staff posts. His large experience includes procurement, project management, logistics, finance. Currently, he is the chief of Turkish Military Archives Branch, the Graduate School Personnel Directorate, and Military History and Strategic Studies Department. The paper title is Imperialism and Nationality in the Ottoman Sample. Bülent, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honored guest, I'm very excited to be here in front of the distinguished guest. Now, what I was trying to establish when I was preparing this proceeding is that how Ottomans managed to unite this multinational environment and continued 500 years, and how it dissolved. So, when the Ottoman state was formally established, there was a quite suitable environment for an advance towards new territories, because there was the weakened Eastern Roman territory in the west of the Ottoman state and the Anatolian territory disintegrated into beyliks following the collapse of Seljuk state in the east. Since the moment of its establishment, the Ottoman state began to expand in the Eastern Roman territory in the west and the Anatolian territory. We can examine the reasons facilitating the expansion of the Turks by categorizing them under the title of religious, economics, political, and military reasons. The religious reasons were the religious instability and disharmony in the Balkans and the intensification of the struggle between Orthodox and Latin Church starting in the 13th century. So the struggle of religious sects between Catholic Latins, comprising the Christian sectarian group, and the Orthodox Rums and Slavs, promoted Turkish advance. The Catholic pressure harassed the Orthodox in the region. The understanding of religious liberty, which only prevailed among the Turks at that time, enabled the members of many different religions and sects to live in peace and welfare under the Pax Ottomana. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror issued a firman recognizing the religious and civil rights of the Fener Rum Orthodox Patriarch within the frame of the Turkish Islamic law. The firman stipulated the Patriarch and the other religious dignitaries should be deemed as venerable, safe from any damage, and exempt from every tax and liability. The Patriarch was recognized to be of the same status as that of the Vizier and given the right to enter the presence of the Sultan or attend the Divan Imperial Council meeting to discuss the problems of his community. Moreover, a unit of Janissary guards was commissioned with the protection of the Patriarch. All the churches on the imperial territory were left to the administration of Ottoman clergymen, and free practice of religious ceremonies was allowed. Thus, Sultan Mehmed, Conqueror, solidified the protection of Patriarch as a state policy. As for the economic reason, there was a complete crisis experienced in the economic structure of the Balkans in that period. Having the possession of great part of the Balkans, the Eastern Roman Empire entered into long struggle with the rich base owning territory. This struggle became intensified in the last years of Eastern Roman Empire, which was finally defeated by the landowners. The feudal system and the distribution of land, which were quite similar to the feudality of the Middle Ages in Europe, turned the rich landowners into most independent princes. The Christian peasants, under the persecution of the wealthy landowners, were waiting for a rescuer to come to their help. In the end, these awaited rescuers happened to be the Turks. The disciplined and equitable treatment of the Turks and their imposition of reasonable taxes that could be afforded by the public were influential on this outcome. The policy based on the tolerance facilitated the expansion of the Ottomans in Rumeli. Yet, it is the good treatment displayed by the Ottomans towards the Orthodox Church and the tax policy they implemented enabled the acceptance of Ottoman administration by large masses of people and the peasant classes. The Ottoman administration earned the whole Balkan Peninsula a political and commercial unity. As a matter of fact, the Balkans flourished considerably in economic aspect. Agricultural production increased, and many new towns and villages were established as of the 15th century. The domestic and foreign trade in Balkans made an unprecedented progress. However, the French Revolution, initiated by the people and the middle class, known as bourgeoisie, in the form of rebellions against the absolute kingdom on 14 June 1789, has universal qualities in terms of its results, impact, and persecutions. The Great Revolution, called at the end of the New Age and the beginning of Modern Age by many historians, did not only pave the way for creation of new types of society in its area of occurrence, but also made a very rapid and wide diffusion. Therefore, it had political, cultural, and legal results on the whole world, especially in Europe. This Great Revolution should be evaluated as a great history leap with its impact and the ensuing intellectual trends reaching our time. And prior to 19th century, the Ottoman state had the imperial tradition prevailing on a multi-racial and multi-religious area of long centuries. However, within the 20 years, as of Congress of Vienna, the Ottoman nobles realized the needs for change in state in accordance with the notions they perceived as the new concept of power and legality. While reshaping an experienced state according to the requirements of civilization standards, in order to include it as an elite member in the family of empires related to each other globally in the 19th century, Ottoman nobles had to think the significant position held by the Christians among the claims of legality asserted by the other empires. They noticed the contradiction in the fact that the leaders and the public opinion in Russian, British, and French empires insisted on the liberation of Christian elements within the Ottoman state while they tried to enhance their colonial sovereignty in the Muslim areas in Asia, Africa, and Europe. The ethnical structure of the Balkans influenced the Balkan political geography, and a minority within every country became a problem throughout the history. Furthermore, the fact that every ethnic group was supported by a state having the same religion or lineage was a great factor in continuation of never-ending fights, struggles, and intervention in this geography. As small independent states were formed during the disintegration process of Balkan Peninsula from Ottoman state, their political boundaries presented an unnatural quality which was caused by the great powers of Europe intentionally, because in such an environment, the Balkans would always remain as an area vulnerable to intervention, and the great powers would always have the opportunity to interfere with the regional affairs when their interests were endangered. As a result of national movements starting with the French Revolution, the Balkans nations began to revolt and gain their independence individually. First initiated in the form of autonomy, these movements of independence became an international issue as a result of intervention of great European powers. There was a single reality: the Ottoman state, called the sick man, was collapsing, and it was indispensable aim for almost all active states in Europe to take their own share out of it. Russia, Britain, France, Austria even started a race to exert control on the Balkans in the 19th century and tried to become superior to each other through political games. The Balkan nations, being manipulated by the East European states for their imperialist aim, were rising up separately with their support and provocation. And the strategy that the Balkan nations would follow in their uprising was also determined by those European states. The road of these uprisings was obvious: reform, concession, autonomy, and independence. For the time construction, I am skipping some parts of my proceeding. You can read when it's published. Attaining the right of guardianship for the Balkan nations in the 19th century, the European states preferred the establishment of many small and weak states to the establishment of a big and powerful one in Balkans. The greatest evidence of it is their signing the Treaty of Berlin, stipulating the formation of a smaller and divided Bulgaria instead of Treaty San Stefano establishing Great Bulgaria. The European powers based their foreign policies on the disintegration of Ottoman state and seizure of the greatest share out of it. They often reshaped their foreign policy and thus succeeded in safeguarding their interests. While showing a rigid stance against the revolutionary movements in Europe, Russia gave every support to the rebellions of Slavs living under the Ottoman state in order to incite them with pan-Slavism, and France, which supported the rebels on Ottoman territory, prevented Prussia from entering into Belgian territory during the independence movement of Belgium and tried to justify its action on the pretext that other states were not entitled to determine the destiny of their neighbors. However, they did not see any inconvenience in determining the fate of the ethnicity living as Ottoman subjects under the Ottoman rule and helping them to form independent state. Following the Treaty of Paris and Berlin, Britain, bearing in mind that the Ottoman state would not be able to preserve its territorial integrity, became positioned in Egypt under the pretext of suppressing the rebellion and supported the rebellious movements in Balkans. Russia, as of 19th century, the relations between two countries became much strained and four great battles were fought. Since Greece won its independence, the Eastern question arose. The idea of superiority that Russia tried to gain over the Ottoman state was not approved by the Western states, which led them to take side with the Ottomans. The subsequent Crimean War hindered Russia. However, the Treaty of San Stefano and Berlin, which represented a turning point, ended the sovereignty of the Ottoman state in Balkan considerably. Austria, as one of the most influential rivals of Ottomans, made alliance with Britain for maintenance of territorial integrity of Ottoman state, which actually aimed to impede the Russian dreams of founding a Slavic state in Balkans and prevent the Ottomans from going under Russian control. In conclusion, the foundation of independent Balkans as a result of national uprising can be counted as one of the most important elements accelerating the collapse of Ottoman Empire. The works of Westerns and especially Balkan historians consider foreign support, namely intervention of European states in the affirmation revolts, as the most efficient factor in the Balkan nations becoming independent. Yet, the Balkan nations had already reached a certain maturity in military, political, administrative, economic, and cultural terms before the involvement of European states. If the Balkan nations had not shown the necessary resistance, no European state would be able to take a role in the process. The greatest obstacle was the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where decisions were made for the maintenance of the existing status and the suppression of any possible uprising that could break out within the empires. The resistance against these decisions was the result of fighting determination of rebels, and it was an inevitable historical end of the Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbians, and Romanians to become independent. Therefore, even in the absence of foreign support, the Ottoman state would finally have to lose its territory in the Balkans with delays of 20 or 30 years. However, through the bargains based on the interest of great powers, the dynasties exported from Europe were brought to power in these states, which lacked an aristocracy, where the movements of independence were assumed by peasants and the intelligentsia. The situation can be considered to have created a negative impact on the political and economic development of newly formed Balkans. I would like to conclude my presentation with the words of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. It says, "Ladies and gentlemen, today the Balkan nations exist as individual political entities such as Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, at that time Yugoslavia, and Turkey. The nations owning all these states have lived together for centuries. We can say that the Balkan states of today, including Republic of Turkey, which came into existence in the last centuries, are the historical results of the gradual disintegration of Ottoman Empire and its final burial into history. In this sense, the Balkan nations have a common history lasting for centuries. If this history includes sorrowful memories, all the Balkans have had their share in experiencing them. And the share of the Turks has not been less painful. And you, the esteemed representatives of Balkan nations, will overcome the mixed feelings and calculations of the past, establish principles of deep fraternity, open up wide horizons for unity. You will put forward the great realities that were neglected and forgotten previously." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bülent, for your very good presentation. Now we can move to the third and last one, presented by Dr. Zisis Fotakis from Greece, graduated in history from the Athens University, in economy and science, social history from the Oxford University, and PhD in naval history. His monograph, Greek Naval Strategy and Policy, 1910-1919, has been awarded by the Hellenic Academy of Arts and Science. Dr. Fotakis has written extensively on Greek naval history. He teaches He teaches naval history, and he's the director of the Naval History Research Laboratory at the Hellenic Naval Academy. The paper title is Sea Power, Organizational and Technological Innovation and Greek War of Independence, 1830. The floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, the possession of sea power by the Greeks in 1821, for the first time since the Middle Ages, greatly facilitated the successful issue of the Greek War of Independence. This paper focuses on the innovative spirit of Greek naval policy at the time and comments on its legacy up to the First World War. 4 centuries of comfortable Ottoman victories over Greek rebellious activity came to an end in 1821, when the Greeks developed a solid revolutionary movement, which owed much to the Ottoman inability to destroy the Greek fleet. The Ottoman Navy possessed 17 capital ships and many more frigates, corvettes, and brigs, while its Greek opponent deployed only a limited number of brigs and a couple of corvettes. Considering that the naval ordnance of a frigate was twice as powerful as that of smaller naval units, the Ottoman superiority in firepower and armor vis-à-vis its Greek opponent is obvious. The Ottoman Navy was also far more capable of boarding and capturing Greek naval units, due to the sizable number and ability of its marines. However, its slow-moving, badly handled capital ship squadrons proved incapable of facing down the light and speedy, well-handled ex-merchantmen of the Greek fleet. The rigid adherence of the Turk to the line ahead and the inflexible organization of the Ottoman fleet weakened considerably the Ottoman superiority in naval materiel vis-à-vis its Greek opponent. The Greeks soon realized the impotence of their naval artillery to inflict serious damage on the Ottoman Navy, as well as the difficulty to develop their own naval gunnery skills in a short time, despite the corresponding training that they would receive by distinguished Philhellene gunnery specialists. Moreover, Greek naval gunnery gradually declined in numbers because of the many financial limitations that hindered the development of a sizable Greek naval force. The Greek Navy covered much of its firepower deficit by converting old but seaworthy brigs into fireships during the first 3 years of the Greek War of Independence. In doing so, the Greeks were inspired by Greek fireship successes against the Ottoman Navy in the course of the Russo-Turkish naval battle of Çeşme in 1770, and by the corresponding advice of Captain Hamilton of the British Aegean Squadron and that of the Russian Philhellene Ivan Afanassiev. Admiral Cochrane, the commander-in-chief of the Greek fleet between 1825 and 1828, also undertook the construction of a hybrid type of fireship that could be used both at sea and against coastal defenses. Finally, Captain Hastings, a Philhellene and former British naval officer, put forward plans for building an explosive, so to say, fireship. The dismal technical failure of the Cochranite fireship model and the unattractiveness of Hastings' proposal meant that Greek fireships remained all of the same type, namely brigs. The utilization of the fireship by the Greek Navy was not seen as a means of annihilating the enemy naval force. Instead, it was expected that its attritional effect on the materiel and the morale of the Ottoman Navy will undermine the Ottoman will to fight a long war against the Greeks. To this purpose, the Greek Navy increased the lethality of the fireship by manning it, unlike most fireships in other navies that were usually unmanned. This organizational innovation in the tactical deployment of the fireship by the Greeks was reinforced by the upgrade of its ignition and fire transmission mechanisms and by the inclusion of petrol and camphor oil in the combustible materials that filled Greek fireships. Up to the Greek War of Independence, fireships in European naval warfare mainly undertook surprise night attacks against anchored enemy fleets. Admiral Miaoulis, the leader of the Greek fleet for most of the duration of the Greek War of Independence, extended the use of fireships by making them the principal offensive weapon of the Greek fleet, extended the use of fireships by making them the principal offensive weapon of the Greek fleet in daytime naval operations. Under the deep cover of smoke, which was produced by the black powder of the Greek naval guns, Greek fireships attacked overwhelming concentrations of enemy naval power in broad daylight with the aim to disperse them. At the close of these naval encounters, the Greek Navy surrounded and sank any isolated Ottoman naval units that were left behind. Fireships acted also as a shield of the Greek fleet anytime the wind immobilized it, whenever Greek naval units had to stay anchored in order to support Greek amphibious operations, and while they were trying to deny the projection of enemy naval power upon focal Greek ports and islands. Indeed, the defensive role of the Greek fireships was frequently as heroic as the work of many light units that protected battleships and convoys during the two world wars of the 20th century. The reinforcement of the Ottoman Navy by the French-trained Egyptian fleet in 1824 and the new emphasis of the Ottoman fleet on fast frigates and light units during the same year gradually safeguarded it against the fireship threat. When the declining reliability of the fireship became evident, alternative technological solutions were considered by the Greeks. After the abortive attempt to build a steamship in the Greek island of Psara in 1822, French friends of Greece advocated the adoption of a ship which could sail underwater. The submarine in 1825 was at about the same stage of development as the steamship, but the argument for procuring steam-driven warships was more persuasive. Captain Hastings pushed forward the idea of employing steam-driven warships by the Greek Navy. In his memorandum to Lord Byron in 1823, Hastings argued that since the Greek revolutionaries had no artillery or engineers, they could never capture the remaining Turkish fortresses in Peloponnesus unless they starved them out. Since these were all supplied by sea, and any Turkish invasion of southern Greece would also be dependent on its continual resupply by sea, naval superiority was required. Hastings reasoned that naval superiority could be achieved by the possession of one steam vessel. In action, such a vessel could be maneuvered to produce a higher rate of fire than the enemy. Furthermore, instead of firing cold cannonballs, she could, with certain precautions, fire red-hot shot, heated in the ship's boilers, which would have a far greater destructive effect. Hastings also suggested numerous other technical and tactical improvements and sketched out the chief characteristics of the type of vessel he had in mind. Hastings' proposals were obviously novel. The steamship had far from proved itself as a naval weapon, although well enough tested for civil purposes. The East India Company had made use of one in the Burma River War with some success, but that was hardly decisive evidence. No major navy had yet adopted steam in any of its main ships. Despite the risk of adopting an untested technology, the declining reliability of the fireship and the replenishment of the Greek public coffers by the proceeds of the city loans which were contracted for Greece in London between 1824 and 1825 facilitated its adoption by the Greek Navy. Furthermore, Lord Cochrane, the new commander-in-chief of the Greek Navy and an early advocate of steam-driven warships, also required, quote, 6 steam vessels having each 2 guns in the bow and perhaps 2 in the stern, not less than 68 pounder long guns, end of quote. A considerable part of the loan money was consequently set aside for building a fleet of 6 steam-driven warships, whose completion was expected to take place by early 1826. However, the incorporation of new technology in the design of these ships, the troubled relationship between those who superintended their construction, the repeatedly mistaken Cochranite interventions in the design process of the ships, and the skillful attempts of Mehmet Ali of Egypt, an ally of the Ottoman Sultan, to delay their building by the firm of Alexander Galloway of Smithfield, London, meant that only one of them, the Carteria, arrived in Greece in time to make a worthy contribution to the fighting. Carteria was a 4-masted. Carteria is the black one. You can see from the smoke that this is the steamship I'm talking about. Carteria was a 4-masted paddle steamer with schooner rigging that was armed with 4 68 pounder guns and 4 68 pounder Pexan carronades. She was not short of problems. Under canvas, she seemed satisfactory, if slow. Her engines were not powerful enough, and the paddles were too high in the water. These problems were hardly significant, though, in view of the autonomy of movement and her few but powerful guns, which contrasted with a large number of less powerful naval cannons of diverse calibers with which most warships were armed at the time. Indeed, Carteria could be seen as a forerunner of the dreadnought revolution of the early 1900s in terms of naval gunnery and maneuverability. She destroyed many enemy naval units, captured a good number of enemy depot ships, destroyed Ottoman coast defenses, and covered Greek landings in Volos, Trikeri, Piraeus, Missolonghi, and elsewhere. Her crowning achievement took place in the naval battle of Itea in 1827, when she sank 9 Ottoman warships, providing the first persuasive evidence of the fighting ability of steam-driven warships in world naval history. The successful record of Carteria was not met by the performance of her sister ships. The Enterprise, the Irresistible, and the Mercury, their English names, came to Greece late in the war and in no technical capacity to fight successfully at sea. No further funds were made available for the completion of the Alert and the Lacer, and they were abandoned to rot in the Thames. Thus, the Cochranite vision of the destruction of the whole Ottoman fleet could not be realized. In the end, Turkish naval inability, Greek innovation and seamanship, and the generally indecisive nature of most sea fights in the age of sail contributed to a 6-year protraction of the Greek War of Independence, a recurrent phenomenon in wars between land powers like the Ottoman Empire and sea powers, naval powers like Greece. In the course of the Greek War of Independence, the Greek Navy effected the replenishment of the Greek revolutionary forces and hindered that of the Turkish armies fighting in mountainous and poorly endowed southern Greece. As a result, the numerical superiority of the Turkish forces was never crushing, and peace was eventually restored only after great power intervention in favor of Greece in the latter half of the 1820s. The innovative and largely successful Greek naval policy of the 1820s influenced Greek naval affairs until the First World War. The desirability of possessing an innovative navy was seen favorably by a good number of Greek statesmen. was pursued heartily by the best of them, premiers Trikoupis and Venizelos. The Greek employment in naval operations of the seaplane and the submarine for the first time in world naval history, just before the First World War, speaks for itself. Moreover, the strengths and limitations of the fire ship and the capital ship, i.e. Carteria, during the Greek War of Independence, supported the development of the Greek Navy along the battleship line and the procurement of a significant number of light units in the age of imperialism. In conclusion, the Greek fleet of the 1820s confirmed a common observation in world military history, namely that smaller states with limited means are frequently open to innovation, which promises to meet their defense needs cheaply. In the course of the Greek War of Independence, the Greek Navy enjoyed an organizational and technological advantage over its Ottoman opponent at critical moments. This, the Greek Navy tried to maintain in times of crisis during the long 19th century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Thesis, for your great overview about this important issue on technology and to stay on timing. So you can pass to the round of questions. There is a microphone available. Please say your name, country, and to whom you're asking the question. So please.
Adam Storing from Great Britain. I would like to thank all three of the panelists for three very, very interesting papers. My question is for Herr Echternkamp. I was wondering, sir, if you would it be possible to characterize the developments that you've described to us, particularly as a question of class? You are based in Potsdam. You, of course, know that the Prussian state and many German states had forms of compulsory military service through the 18th century. But, of course, as you know, it was restricted, overwhelmingly to the peasants. I mean, to what extent would you say that the story you've told us today is about the process by which the middle class was mobilized for war and the middle class willingly wanted to go to war? Thank you.
Please, Job.
Well, thank you, Adam, for this question, which gives me the chance to indeed put an emphasis on this class factor. When I think of class in this context of propaganda, nationalism, and war, I have immediately, or I think the most important point here is that what I have described, these ideas of the nation, the tribes, and the effort of mobilizing the people in the name of the nation, is indeed a class phenomenon in the sense that it was only a very small part of society, which is I would say the German term is the Bildungsbürgertum, the educated middle classes, that partly felt attracted by this idea. In other words, and that's why I'm very grateful for you to give me a chance to elaborate on this. In other words, what I said was a phenomenon restricted to a very small part of society, and it only grew into a mass movement in the course of the 19th century. And as to the mobilization of the military effects, all the campaigns in these wars were not mainly fought by mobilized masses, but by regular armies. So that's a different aspect, but it is also something that is worth being mentioned. Thank you.
Other question? Yes, please.
Morning. Thank you very much, all of three. for your super presentation. I would like to ask you a question to Mr. Durgun, Professor Durgun. When we refer to the imperial Turkish, we refer to a political system, the Sultanate, a kind of monarchy, and so. And now you are a republic. And then my question is, in this context, right now, during the last century, you have made any kind of revisions of the old history of the Imperial Turkey. I mean, is right now in the school, in the universities, or whatever, the history of the Imperial Turkey is seen differently than 100 years ago. Thank you.
Please, Bullet.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question. What I understand from your question is that what is the difference from our understanding of the democracy right now and the history of Ottoman? How do we look the history of Ottoman Empire from our democratic point of view, right? Okay. So we are all on this geography or the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So we are, as long as the other neighboring countries are the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So the continuity of the states, we are responsible of the continuation of Ottoman Empire as the international legal system. So just like the other states, as they are continuing the Ottoman on their territories, just like Bulgaria, Greece, Slovenia, or the others in the Middle Eastern. So we are a different country right now, and we respect everything we had in the past, we did, and we are trying to make or continue a state coming from the back of the East Romans. You know, the Ottomans were the ancestors of the East Roman as well as the Seljuk states. So we just respect the things that happened in the past, and we are a different country as the Turkish Republic of Turkey. That's how we look at the things in the past. Thank you for your question.
It should work. Thank you, all speakers. I have a question for my good friend, Zisis Fotakis. You made several references to the British involvement, Captain Hastings buying British ships. How far was the British government or the British Navy involved in assisting the Greek Navy? Was it officially, unofficially? What went on behind the scenes? That I would like to ask you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. The British did not actively intervene in the Greek War of Independence, officially speaking, before 1823. In 1823, they recognized Greece as one of the two warring parties. So it was kind of, indirect official, recognition of statehood. So they recognized our right to blockade Ottoman coasts and to perform naval operations against the Ottomans. This was a first small step towards the direction that will eventually lead to Navarino. The British were involved in Greek affairs at the time, mostly to constrain the possibility of Russian expansion, because Russia was very popular in Greece, and Russia was also the only power at the beginning of the Greek War of Independence that was doing something for Greeks. Perhaps it was not enough, but it was the only power that one could say that something will take place that will eventually favor the Greek cause. So Canning was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, and Canning was known for his libertarian views, for his assistance to Latin American states, though the Latin American case and the Greek case are quite different. The Latin American revolutions were very conducive to the extension of British merchant interests to another part of the world, whereas in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant Company was very much against the Greek War of Independence. Greeks were a maritime nation, and they were already competing against the British in the Eastern Mediterranean, and not only. So had a Greek state been, instituted at some point, the state backing of the Greek merchant marine would probably make it even stronger competitor of the British merchant houses that were active in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a complex picture. So before 1827, mostly British involvement in Greek affairs was through individuals, high-profile individuals. There were not many, but they were high-profile. They were influential. I had a discussion with a good colleague earlier today, and he was asking me about Philhellenism in general, and I told him that, half of the Europeans that fought for the Greek cause were Germans and Austrians. So numerically, the German world gave half of the total number of the Philhellenists, but none of them was a big name like Byron, like, so many British or French intellectuals that took an active position in favor of the Greek cause. So, yes, but coming back to the essence of your question, the British fleet was helpful to Greek interests after the Battle of Navarino, and that's why its head, Admiral Codrington, was removed from his place shortly afterwards, a few months afterwards. And that's why he suffered discrimination in the British naval service for about a decade, until he was reinstated fully and he was honored properly for his great victory in Navarino. Britain is a special case. There were some favoring us. There were many others that were against us. So there was political infighting. And of course, when Canning passed away and Wellington succeeded him, the British policy in general and British naval policy in particular reverted against to a pro-Turkish, pro-Ottoman stance. But it's a long, we can talk over coffee about it. It's very, twists and curves, very many, and to cut a long story short, individuals help much more, British individuals, British naval personas help much more Greece rather than any help from the British Aegean Squadron of the British Mediterranean Fleet.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
There is a question over there from General Ottner.
Thank you. Fantastic papers. It was worth getting up in the morning for this really interesting panel. Congratulations. I have a little comment to my colleague Jörg Echtenkamp from Potsdam. Just a comment. It's quite interesting regarding different approaches of, let's say, common military history, especially when the unveiling of the monument of Leipzig happened in 1913. It was quite interesting that Berlin and Vienna newspapers had a deep quarrel because, especially in Vienna, let's say the official military were a little bit sorry to say, pissed off because Leipzig was made a German victory. Also, we all know the High Commander was Prince Schwarzenberg. But it's quite interesting for the internal approach because the Germans made it a German victory, and on the other hand, the Austrians tried to make it not a German victory, not because of Germany, but because of a supranational state of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So we wanted to do everything to avoid to make it a German victory, but it should be a supranational, multinational victory to avoid this, Germanization and nationalism, which was, of course, for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, let's say, a bad story. I think it's quite interesting how different the approaches are. You made, let's say, a national myth out of this and a propaganda effect, what was, of course, quite clear. And on the other hand, in Vienna, everybody tried to back it down as being a nationalized victory. Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Any other question?
I've got a comment,
Yeah,
if I may,
please.
but if there are no other questions. I've got a comment on my colleague's presentation. If I understand correctly, the essence of his presentation was about religious liberty and political harmony reigning in the Ottoman Empire. I don't subscribe to this view, and I think history does not subscribe to this view. Talking about Greece, there have been more than 30 revolutions against the Ottoman Empire between 1453 and 1821. So one revolution per decade, more or less, per dozen years. And these revolutions were not made because some great power made us to revolt against Turks. These revolutions were made because there was not this liberty and harmony. That's why they were made. Of course, great powers intervened whenever they saw some opening to further their interests in the area, that's for sure. But there were problems. There were problems in Greece, there were problems in Serbia, there were problems in Montenegro, in Bulgaria. We are talking about of many tens, perhaps more than 100 Balkan revolutions against the Ottoman Empire within less than 400 years. So this is not political harmony, this is not religious liberty, this is not, a society that is happy with its life and its, and its daily routine. This is my comment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any other question? So the debate was very good, so it means that the speakers provided us a very good papers. So thank you very much to the speakers, also the interpreters for his very good works. Thank you very much.
Sağ olun.